When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the world and rejected the IMF's ultimatum, backed by Trump's push, to hand over a staggering 70% of Burkina Faso's gold reserves as payment for debts, it was more than a refusal. It was a declaration of independence. For decades, African nations have been trapped in cycles of loans, interest, and resource seizures that leave their people impoverished while their wealth fuels Western economies. But Traoré's bold defiance was a turning point, a rare moment when a leader of a small, landlocked African nation looked global powers in the eye and said, "Enough." What many expected to be a quiet financial arrangement instead erupted into a dramatic confrontation that challenged the very foundation of Western control over Africa. This was not simply about debt or gold. It was about sovereignty, about reclaiming dignity stolen since the colonial era, and about protecting the inheritance of future generations. The world watched as sanctions loomed, alliances shifted, and a wave of Pan-African solidarity began to rise. In this video, we dive deep into what really happened after Traoré's historic refusal, the storm it unleashed across global politics, and how this single act of defiance is rewriting Africa's role in the balance of world power. In recent years, the political landscape of West Africa has been shaped by a remarkable story of resistance, sovereignty, and the fight against economic domination. Among the figures leading this charge stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader of Burkina Faso, who has risen to prominence not only in his own country, but across the African continent. His name has become synonymous with a new form of defiance against Western powers, particularly the United States, France, and international financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The episode, commonly described as Traoré blocking Trump's IMF 70% gold seizure over debt, captures a watershed moment in this confrontation, symbolizing the struggle of African nations to reclaim their resources and resist centuries-old patterns of exploitation. To fully grasp the gravity of this moment, one must look beyond the headline and into the geopolitical, economic, and ideological battle that shaped what happened next. Burkina Faso, a landlocked West African nation, is among the top producers of gold on the continent. Gold constitutes the lifeblood of the Burkinabe economy, yet paradoxically, the majority of its people remain among the poorest in the world. This contradiction is not accidental. For decades, multinational corporations and foreign powers have extracted Burkina Faso's mineral wealth under exploitative agreements that leave the state with crumbs while the bulk of profits flow abroad. International financial institutions, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, have compounded the problem by offering loans tied to strict conditions, which in many cases force governments to cut social spending, privatize public assets, and surrender sovereignty over resource management. For Burkina Faso, this dependency had reached a boiling point by the time Ibrahim Traoré assumed leadership in 2022. The episode in question began with mounting debt pressures. Like many African states, Burkina Faso carried billions in debt accumulated under previous regimes. These debts, often negotiated under unfair terms, were in large part a legacy of IMF structural adjustment programs that had hollowed out state capacity. As inflation surged, the CFA franc remained pegged to the euro, limiting Burkina Faso's monetary flexibility. Western creditors, particularly through the IMF, sought repayment in ways that Traoré and his supporters described as neo-colonial extortion. The most shocking of these demands reportedly came during negotiations when, according to several accounts, Trump-aligned U.S. representatives and IMF envoys pressed Burkina Faso to surrender up to 70% of its gold reserves as collateral for debt restructuring. This demand was seen by Traoré as nothing short of economic slavery. For the IMF and Washington, the argument was pragmatic. They insisted that Burkina Faso's debt load had become unsustainable and that securing repayment through gold exports was the only realistic mechanism. Yet the demand was not merely financial, it was political. Gold is Burkina Faso's sovereign wealth, and to seize such a massive share would effectively strip the nation of its economic independence. In making this demand, Western institutions underestimated the fierce nationalism and Pan-Africanist ideology that had come to define Traoré's rule. Unlike past leaders who might have conceded under pressure, Traoré stood firm, refusing to surrender what he described as the soul of the nation. In a dramatic speech broadcast to the people of Burkina Faso and later circulated widely on African social media platforms, Traoré denounced the IMF and Western powers for attempting to exploit his country. He framed the gold seizure demand as a continuation of colonial plunder, declaring that our resources are not collateral for your debts, they are the inheritance of our children. He went further, stating that Burkina Faso would rather face sanctions than surrender its sovereignty. His defiance struck a chord across Africa, where decades of IMF-imposed austerity had crippled economies from Ghana to Zambia. Traoré was hailed as a modern-day Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s who had resisted imperialism before being assassinated. The refusal to comply with IMF demands set off a geopolitical storm. The United States, under Trump's influence in international financial affairs, threatened to isolate Burkina Faso from global financial markets. IMF representatives warned of dire consequences, including frozen credit lines, sanctions, and restricted access to international trade. Yet Traoré seemed undeterred. Instead of bowing to pressure, he turned eastward and southward, deepening alliances with non-Western partners. Within weeks, Burkina Faso signed new agreements with Russia, China, and other emerging powers, offering investment and military cooperation in exchange for fairer trade terms. Traoré's government also joined forces with neighboring Mali and Niger to establish a new economic and security pact, signaling the birth of a Pan-African bloc that sought independence from Western control. What happened next was a cascade of consequences that reshaped the balance of power in the region. Economically, Burkina Faso braced for impact. Sanctions from Western institutions initially hit hard, creating shortages in fuel, medicines, and foreign currency reserves. Yet, Traoré's administration prepared by implementing emergency measures. He encouraged the use of local gold in trade agreements with Russia and China, effectively bypassing the IMF. He also launched policies to increase domestic food production, reducing dependency on imported goods. The IMF's blockade, rather than collapsing Burkina Faso, accelerated its pivot towards self-reliance and alternative global partnerships. Politically, the refusal to yield elevated Traoré's image. Across Africa, young people especially saw in him a leader unafraid to challenge the giants of global capitalism. In Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa, social media trended with hashtags praising Traoré's courage. Activists organized rallies calling for their governments to follow Burkina Faso's example. Traoré became a symbol of the long-awaited African awakening, reviving Sankara's vision of an independent, united, and sovereign continent. Western media, however, painted him as reckless and destabilizing, accusing him of dragging his country into unnecessary confrontation. This propaganda war only deepened the divide between African and Western narratives of the same event. Militarily, Traoré's defiance also had consequences. Burkina Faso was already battling jihadist insurgencies across its northern and eastern territories. Traditionally, Western aid, particularly from France and the US, had been tied to counterterrorism efforts. With relations deteriorating, these supports were withdrawn. But instead of leaving Burkina Faso vulnerable, Traoré invited Russian Wagner contractors and strengthened regional military ties. Reports emerged of joint operations between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger's forces, which began reclaiming areas previously dominated by insurgents. In this sense, the IMF's gold seizure demand inadvertently pushed Burkina Faso into the arms of new allies, changing the security dynamics of the Sahel. The standoff also had ripple effects globally. At the IMF headquarters, officials worried about the precedent Traoré had set. If one small African country could resist, what would stop others from rejecting similar demands? In fact, shortly after Burkina Faso's defiance, countries like Zambia and Ghana began renegotiating their IMF debt repayment terms more aggressively. Meanwhile, China and Russia seized the opportunity to present themselves as alternative partners, offering loans and trade without the same austerity strings attached. The Global South watched carefully, and the West's grip on resource-rich regions began to loosen. Inside Burkina Faso, the struggle was far from easy. The economy faced inflation, supply chain disruptions, and temporary shortages. Critics argued that Traoré's gamble risked plunging the nation deeper into poverty. Yet for many Burkinabe citizens, the short-term pain was worth the long-term gain of sovereignty. Town hall meetings and public rallies revealed a population willing to endure sacrifices for the promise of dignity and independence. Farmers, miners, and workers repeatedly voiced their support, arguing that past compliance with IMF policies had brought nothing but misery anyway. For the first time in decades, many felt they had a leader who represented their interests rather than foreign ones. In Washington, Trump's allies attempted to spin the situation as a failure of African governance, accusing Traoré of aligning with America's rivals. Yet within the U.S. itself, progressive voices and African diaspora groups pushed back, highlighting the hypocrisy of demanding 70% of a poor nation's gold reserves while ignoring Wall Street corruption and domestic inequality. The IMF, too, faced backlash from scholars and activists who argued that its policies had long served to entrench Western dominance rather than promote genuine development. The Burkina Faso episode became a case study in universities and think tanks, sparking debates on the future of international finance. As weeks turned into months, it became clear that Traoré had not only survived the IMF confrontation, but emerged stronger. Burkina Faso's gold remained under national control, and though economic challenges persisted, the sense of national pride and unity soared. In the broader context, his resistance inspired a wave of African leaders to reconsider their relationships with Western institutions. Discussions emerged within the African Union about creating a continental financial institution independent of the IMF. While still in early stages, these conversations reflected the momentum generated by Traoré's defiance. The long-term implications of the IMF gold seizure standoff are still unfolding, but several themes are already evident. First, it marked a definitive shift in Africa's willingness to challenge Western dominance. Second, it revealed the growing multipolarity of the world, where nations like Burkina Faso could turn to alternative partners beyond the West. Third, it reignited Pan-Africanist dreams of unity and self-reliance. Finally, it exposed the fragility of Western financial institutions' legitimacy in the global South. The IMF, once seen as untouchable, now faces growing skepticism and resistance. In conclusion, the episode of Traoré blocking Trump's IMF 70% gold seizure over debt was far more than a dispute over resources. It was a symbolic and practical turning point in the battle for African sovereignty. Traoré's refusal to surrender his nation's wealth became a rallying cry for a continent tired of being exploited. What happened next was not the collapse of Burkina Faso but the strengthening of its resolve, the diversification of its alliances, and the inspiration of millions across Africa and beyond. The story continues to unfold, but one thing is certain: Traoré has etched his name into history as a leader who dared to say no when the world expected him to bow. His defiance may have cost Burkina Faso economically in the short term, but it also may have laid the groundwork for a future where African nations control their destiny, their resources, and their dignity.